Thank you very much for that introduction. Can you all see my screen? Yes, okay. First, I want to say thank you to the organizers for pulling together this amazing conference. I am just so lucky, I feel, to have interacted with such inspirational, thoughtful, and passionate educators from around the globe. And thank you for graciously including me and allowing me to present my paper after I missed it yesterday. You're modeling true inclusion in your work, so thank you very much. This paper was intended to be kind of a case study of one institution, the University of Rhode Island in the United States. But I hope that some of the key points or the larger frameworks will be useful to any of you who are faculty or do work with faculty at institutions and universities in many countries, because I think the framework it can be useful. So thank you very much. Why do I talk about faculty development? I think that I really like Bernstein's quote from 2010 that every teacher should treat every course as an opportunity to learn how to create better learning environments and generate rich educational experiences. That's our job as educators. And I truly believe that most educators want to be inclusive and they want to be excellent, but we're rarely prepared to teach inclusively, or quite frankly, in the United States, to teach at all. University faculty are experts in chemistry and business and psychology and sociology, but they have never maybe even had any course on how to teach or pedagogy. And so that's the backdrop from which I do this work on my university and some of the talks I give around the United States. For those of us who are scholars, we read, right? We often go to look and we go to read to help us be better pedagogues, better administrators, better inclusive excellence folks. But the literature on inclusive excellence and inclusive pedagogy, diversity pedagogy, is quite frankly an unwieldy mix of theory, empirical studies, opinion, and promising practices. And so faculty, educators, we have to kind of sift through all of these writings, often written outside of our own discipline, to determine what might work in our own classroom or our own situation or our own college. And that's pretty overwhelming for a chemist or a physics teacher or a math teacher who is also trying to live their life, to be a good classroom manager, and maybe publish if they're a tenure track faculty member. And so I just wanted to give you a sense from the bodies of literature that you might read if you want to learn more about this. Look at these are entire bodies of literature with hundreds of articles and book chapters in them. You could read about inclusive pedagogy, culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally sustaining, anti-racist, decolonizing, feminist, queer, critical, transgressive. This is just a smattering, right, of the pedagogical paradigms available to faculty. And so often when I talk to a math teacher or a chemistry teacher, they say, no, too much. I can't. This is outside my wheelhouse. This is outside my area of expertise, and I'm just overwhelmed, so I'm not going to do anything. Or just tell me the answer. Tell me what to do. Neither of which is very helpful for the students in their classrooms. And so I'll give you a brief history of the workshops that I do. In January of 2017, I did a plenary talk for a faculty development program for a couple hundred faculty at my university. And the workshop got really great evaluations, and faculty from all disciplines said I could take something useful from this. And so our provost followed up with me and invited me to expand and develop these into an ongoing inclusive teaching series, because it's not often, quite frankly, that faculty members from different disciplines all agree that something was useful or that they could take something. And so I was pretty honored. And this initiative has been supported by our provost, our academic affairs diversity task force, which is a ongoing committee, and the Office for our Advancement of Teaching and Learning that runs our professional development. And between August 2018 and currently, actually, I'm doing workshops now. I've delivered 40 total workshops. I have 7 scheduled for the summer, and the attendance has been 1,017 people. And so I feel like I've had some good breath. I will say that, as a faculty member really interested in faculty development, I have gone to lots of conferences where people have promised in their abstracts and titles that they're going to offer a fabulous session where I'm going to walk away as an inclusive educator. And I don't know about you all, but sometimes I leave those very disappointed. I leave thinking, oh, what they said I would learn, or it's not quite what I had hoped for, or I'm not sure it's useful for me. And so I always struggled going in with high hopes and leaving with maybe some disappointment. And so in 2009, Adams and Love wrote a book chapter that has continued to resonate with me. And they didn't say this is the way to do faculty development or be an inclusive educator, but they said these are the components. These are the 4 components of what we think is important if you're doing faculty development. So any kind of effective faculty development, and their argument had to include these 4 pieces on the right of the screen. What we as educators bring to our classroom, our biases, our perspectives, our history, our social identities, and then what students bring to the classroom. Do they come with a history of exclusion or isolation, or a history of a lifetime of privileges? Have they had terrible experiences with other instructors? Have they been told that they're not going to succeed? They come with rich and varied experiences to our classrooms. And then also they talked about really distinguishing between curriculum, resources, and materials, and then also the teaching practices and the pedagogy. Of course, they're connected and related, but often we go to faculty development and an instructor will tell us about one of these things. And so Adams and Love say really effective professional development for educators must include all 4 of these things. And that really resonates with me, and it really resonates with all the people that I tend to have in my sessions. So I use this guiding framework. And then on the left, I am familiar with, in the United States, we have decades of literature on what we call campus climate. And so I bring that in a little bit because that is really missing. I think from the quadrant on the right, we are situated as faculty and instructors in a larger campus climate, right? And so if I am a teacher of science at one institution and I am a teacher of science at another institution, our campus climate might be very different. I also think that sometimes we forget to really the power of faculty and educators, the kind of transformative nature of what we do sometimes. And it doesn't just happen in our classrooms, right? It happens in many spheres of influence. So when we advise, when we're talking with students in our office or in a coffee shop on campus, or the work that we do with our colleagues in our departments. And so I add those pieces to my presentations because I don't want faculty to leave narrowly thinking that I turn on inclusive excellence when I go into my classroom and I turn it off when I leave the door of the classroom. That's not true. We have incredible spheres of influence as educators. I also rely on a lot of literature. Too often, I think, especially in the United States, people have historically tried to debunk diversity and inclusive efforts as someone's opinion or political persuasion. And so as a scholar, I make sure that I bring in the literature, and I always talk about action planning. I'll get to that in a second. So here are the 4 workshops that I design and have been delivering. The first is just an introduction to equity and inclusion. So we have kind of a foundation of understanding of what as faculty members we can do to be inclusively excellent in our research, our teaching, our service, our advising, those spheres of influence. The second, and I'll talk about each of these a little bit, so this is just my overview slide. The second is, how do we intentionally design our courses, from the syllabus to the readings, to the activities, to the quizzes, to the papers, to the exams? How do we design them to be inclusive? How do we as teachers deliver our content in a way that is inclusive? And then fourth, I designed a workshop after the first year for our deans and department chairs, our campus leaders, because what we were finding and what the literature says is that individual faculty might be incredibly passionate about being inclusive excellence and educational, kind of doing this work. And if they're not supported by their department chairs or leaders on campus, then they're deterred from doing the work, or and sometimes even feel like they're being targeted for doing this work. And so I designed a workshop just for leaders to talk about the 9 things they can do. So as a pedagogue, my thoughts about how I structure the content of all of these workshops, all 4 of them, is first to always, again, present key insights from the pedagogical, theoretical, and empirical literatures. I don't go overboard, but I do want to remind anyone in my session that this work is rooted in literature and scholarship. I offer some tangible examples of promising practices for inclusion. I always hesitate to offer a diversity checklist. There's no inclusive excellence checklist that works for everyone, but I do find that anthropologists or language professors or physicists who come in want a few tangible ideas, and whether or not they use those in their own classrooms, it starts their thinking process. Well, she gave me a couple of examples, but maybe in my classroom something similar, or ooh, that reminds me of a time when I did some other practice that could be useful. I also try to provide these workshops are 2 hours long, and I try to provide some time for the folks in the session to make meaning in small group discussions and through maybe some individual reflections, because otherwise it just feels like a lot of information being pushed at you, which is of course not inclusive pedagogy at all, right? And so I try to walk the talk. I also encourage some action planning that's in session during conversations, and after the workshop, in post-workshop evaluations. Um, hopefully you can hear me, there's some noise outside. Because what we find is that sometimes when we ask people to think about doing inclusive excellence work, and we give them some ideas, that they leave the session thinking, wow, this is great, and I'm really inspired. And then the routine of their daily life takes over, right? And they had these really great ideas and inspiration in session, and then they don't put it to practice because they just run out of time, or just don't have the tools to do it. And so I do encourage some action planning. I asked them to leave my session by naming 1 or 2 things that they're going to do. What did you learn here? How can you apply something that you learned here today? 1 or 2 things in your own work. I've been doing these workshops since I mentioned 2017, and they've had to be updated to really acknowledge the evolving context, especially in the United States. So our Black Lives Matter movement, the incredible amounts of violence against Asian Americans. We've had a wave of anti-transgender legislation in the United States recently. We also, whether or not you remember this, our former president created a memorandum of executive order called Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping, which sounds inclusive, but it was actually not at all. And it was designed to weed out any inclusive excellence diversity programs that used critical race theory, asked people to think about privilege, talked about intersectionality, systemic racism, positionality, racial humility, unconscious bias. These were actually terms in the memo. And the federal government in the United States at that time said, if you have any trainings or workshops that use these terms, you must either change them or remove them. And so we have a very interesting context. Luckily, we have a new president who immediately stopped that executive order. But I think it's important to note that we have a very decentralized educational system in the United States. And so while many of us breathed a sigh of relief that this executive order was wiped away, we actually have legislation in almost all 50 states right now, and at K through 12 school levels and at the higher education level, that mimic this divisive concept policy. So while the federal legislation has been taken away, we do have some local, state, and educational level policies where people who have these same anti-inclusive beliefs are trying to push through legislation where we're not going to be able to talk about these things as educators. And I can't even imagine a world where that is true. And I think many of you here at this conference also probably can't or don't ever want to imagine a place where educators are told we can't actually use these terms or do this kind of work. So that's the nature of this work has to be evolution, and we have to evolve with what's happening in the world. And in the last session I just moderated, some of the folks, including our current moderator, talked about, we can't just talk about this stuff in a vacuum. The pandemic changed the way we experience the world. And so it is so important for any of us when we do this work to acknowledge that. So I'll just give a quick overview of kind of the nitty gritty and of each of the workshops. So this first one is an introduction to equity and inclusion. And my presentation is inclusive of the basics of inclusion. So we talk about the campus experiences for minoritized students, campus climate, microclimate research. And I give folks a sense that this isn't, again, just my opinion or politics, that this is rooted in decades of literature. And I cite some of them there, and they're at the end of my slide. I'm ask everyone to reflect. How do you situate yourself in this work, whether you're a chemist or a biologist or an engineer or a language professor? How do your intersecting social identities and worldview shape your teaching? Because they do, right? They shape what we do and how we think about the world. When thinking about social justice, what perspectives and experiences do you bring to your classroom? How would you describe your departmental or unit climate for students, faculty, staff from minoritized social identity groups? So situating themselves in their classroom, their units, their departments. And I asked them to leave that session by brainstorming some strategies that they can use to increase inclusion in their spheres of influence, including their office. And that historically has been their physical office. I asked them what their physical space looks like. What are their bookshelves? What are the walls? What are the pictures? What does the physical space look like? And recently I've had to say, what is your visual? What does your virtual space look like? What do people see behind you? Right? What noises do they hear? Your departmental climate, your sphere of influence, your campus, and then your discipline, because we are all connected to a discipline or a profession. And I think that we each can share at conferences like this and really impact our own discipline. So I get them to think about those kind of expanding spheres of influence. The second workshop is about inclusive course design. And quite frankly, this 2-hour workshop could be 200 hours of workshop because there's so much that we could do. And those of us who teach in schools or disciplines of education know that there's never enough time to do this. And so a 2-hour workshop with professors from all over the university who have very different disciplines, it's really hard. So this was the hardest one for me to put together, but based on my own review of the literature, looking for key themes that come up over and over again that also are applicable across disciplines. The 5 key issues that I talk about in that workshop are the importance of signaling our perspective on inclusion from day one, from the syllabus, from the first class session, from the expectations I set, from the virtual communications that I send to students during this pandemic. Signaling inclusion from day one matters. The second is to increase visibility and representation in our course content. The third is to avoid stereotyping and deficit portrayals. There are too many, unfortunately, too many bodies of literature that include what people might think of as visibility and representation for underrepresented groups, but actually are very stereotypical or portray certain populations through very deficit portrayals. And so, for instance, I had 2 pharmacists, 2 faculty members in my session a few years ago, and they said they went back and looked at their curriculum and their clinical curriculum, their training. They realized the only time LGBT issues ever showed up in their curriculum was when they were talking about HIV and AIDS. They thought, oh my goodness, we had no idea, right? So it wasn't until they looked at their curriculum, their course design, and mapped it out and realized that they were certainly including and representing a community, but it was only through a deficit portrayal, and a stereotypical one. Being accessible in terms of folks who have disabilities, but also all kinds of learners, and making sure that our resources and our course is affordable and accessible to students from all social classes and fiscal means. So some of the sample reflection points: how is your course designed to include minoritized people, diverse topics, or social justice issues? Are there specific ways that you'd like to increase the focus on equity, justice, and inclusion? And sometimes I say, so I hear people say, well, I'm a scientist. I teach ocean science. Well, then I talk about, well, what about the inequities in kind of climate, and the inequities in terms of resources being destroyed or used or abused by folks with power? Like, there's ways for every one of our discipline to include course content that is diverse and justice and equitable. And I asked them to leave, before they leave, to brainstorm 2 specific ways they're going to design their courses to be more inclusive. The third is inclusive teaching. I talk about some basic tenets of inclusive and equity pedagogies, but I showed that screen that I showed you all before, that you could study from multiple different paradigms, and you have to find out the one that works for you. I give best practices, some tips and strategies on building trust, being explicit about equity, whether that be in your syllabus statement, your philosophy of teaching, and then addressing exclusion when it happens in the classroom, student to student, you to student, students to you, and how we could do that. I give them some scenarios and they work through it. I asked them to think about what first and last impressions they leave, and what strategies they can do to set a tone of support from day one. And we do some small group discussions, and I actually give them some kind of common diversity teaching scenarios and break them into small groups and say, how would you respond to this? And the beauty of that is that people from different disciplines say, well, I would handle it this way, or I would handle it that way. And we get to learn from each other, because there's no one right way to do this work. The fourth is that workshop for inclusive leadership. And so I talked to department chairs about starting with yourself, check yourself, think about yourself. How do you set the tone for anti-racist work and social justice in your department or unit? Thoughtfully infusing equity into our promotion and tenure processes, right? If people are being asked to do the hard work of inclusive excellence, but it's not rewarded as part of the promotion and tenure system, then people who have limited time and energy might not choose to do it. Even though it's the right thing to do, they might just not choose to do it because it's not utilitarian in that way. Lead efforts to transform the curriculum. That means supporting new courses, revision of old courses, create inclusion in your physical and virtual environments, promoting structural diversity. So when you have an opening, thinking about who you're hiring and what the identities and perspectives they are bringing, supporting faculty and staff who take risks in the United States, and I'm sure in some places around the world. Some of us who do inclusive excellence from an equity and justice perspective get an awful lot of backlash from students in our class, from people on social media, from organizations who troll and threaten us. There are some certain risks for faculty who do this. Respond to exclusion targeted at your faculty members immediately, and then do a lot of professional development for your unit. I do some small group discussions and supervision scenarios, again, for inclusive leaders. I get pretty good evaluations, which is, I'm showing you because I think academics, we can be tough. We're often pretty critical. That's the nature of our work, right? And so to get really pretty consistent positive responses in some of these anonymous evaluations, I think tells me that I might be on the right track. And so my possible evolution for the future is to share the responsibility for professional development. I am doing this on my campus, but I can't be the only person. That we actually have to have entire offices who conduct this kind of work with faculty. We also have to, there's this balance between focusing on kind of inclusive excellence broadly for any minoritized population, whether it be by gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, social class, religion. But then that sometimes makes it so broad that we can't delve into any of those single forms of exclusion. And so I think we need a both and. And so that's my hope for the future. So I want to thank you. I hope I didn't take too much time. I'm going to stop sharing. And thank you so much.